Hello class, my name is Anna and the country I will be talking to you about today is Indonesia. You may notice that the traditional batik shirt that I'm wearing is from that country. For those of you that do not know, Indonesia is an archipelago of over 17,000 islands located in Southeast Asia, below Malaysia and the Philippines. This country is an incredibly rich and diverse history. The fact that it was not a recognized sovereign nation until the 1940s, the amount of ethnic, cultural, and political diversity within the archipelago, and the intensity of disasters faced all play large roles in how the formalization of its disaster management scheme occurred. Indonesia, with its large expanse of islands, is located near the equator in the infamous Ring of Fire. This location makes the nation very susceptible to natural disasters. It also covers a large area of fault lines, making earthquakes a common threat. According to data from World Vision, in 2018 alone, Indonesia experienced at least 8 major earthquakes. Of course, with earthquakes, we see tsunamis as well. A natural phenomenon that also occurs after earthquakes that we see in Indonesia is called liquidation. This happens when the ground essentially turns into mush due to the intense shocks of an earthquake. This disaster in particular is less planned for than those previously mentioned, and as there is currently not any technology to mitigate or detect the possibility of an occurrence. With each type of government that Indonesia has experienced, the approach to disaster management has become more and more centralized. With the now internationally recognized federal government, disaster management has an entity to be housed under formally. The Indonesian federal government works in tandem with local authorities and indigenous authorities to approach disasters. They recognize that, due to the expanse of a country and the variety of disaster response authorities, the responsibility of disaster management is most effective when shared. The National Disaster Management Agency stated in 2017, disaster is a very comprehensive and multidimensional discussion. This effort to share disaster management responsibility is not complete, however. Due to the intense violence that took place during the establishment of the current government, there is some distrust in the federal system. This and the taboo that exists around addressing cultural and ethnic diversity sometimes makes coordination between informal and formal government entities difficult. Thus, considering how confusing the Indonesian disaster management scheme truly is, we see a confused implementation plan. While there is a newly formed federal government entity, as previously mentioned, all levels of government may respond to and plan for a disaster, first depending on the situation at hand. This sometimes may lead to mismanagement of resources and confusion of responsibilities. As seen in that case, we see insufficient responses, as in the Sulawesi earthquakes of this fall. In early October of this year, massive earthquakes hit the island of Central Sulawesi, subsequently causing over 2,000 deaths. There was not one entity that was set to respond to this disaster, causing damage and casualties that may have otherwise been prevented. Warning systems that were mandated by the federal government were not implemented locally, and NGOs did not have on-the-ground government partners to disperse aid immediately. According to the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, Indonesia is currently creating legislation and implementing disaster management practices that would make the division of responsibility more explicit. This would ensure that before, during, and after disasters occur, each entity that responds to can do so in the most effective manner. As responsibilities shift and become more explicit, the federal government recognizes the need for community-based disaster risk reduction and is moving towards implementing more community-based approaches. A key factor of this shift is that it is multi-sectoral and reaches across various levels within these sectors. A specific initiative as a part of this change is the Indonesian Urban Disaster Mitigation Program, as stated by the Asian Urban Disaster Mitigation Program. This initiative is centered around community empowerment and ensuring that local authorities are trained on how to empower their communities with knowledge regarding disaster preparedness. In Indonesia, we see many participants involved in the disaster management scheme. Within the federal government, there is a recently formed National Disaster Management Agency and the military involved. Several NGOs, such as the Red Cross, are also heavily involved. We also see international and domestic organizations such as the United Nations and the Asian Center for Disaster Preparedness, as well as national aid organizations that participate in relief and mitigation efforts. In terms of obstacles to effective disaster management, Indonesia does face a few. Aside from the confused management system, at least a confusion of roles and responsibilities, Indonesia is a developing nation that faces a constraint of resources. Many of its most vulnerable populations for disasters also happen to be the homes of the most vulnerable populations. According to the Asian Development Bank, a little less than half of Indonesian populations live in rural, difficult-to-access places. This leads to difficulty when planning for and responding to disasters in areas with infrastructure that is less likely to withstand the impact of large disasters. With this being stated, centuries of disaster have led to a better understanding of how to respond and prepare in the most effective manner. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 was a pivotal point in disaster management policy for the federal government in Indonesia. Since then, policies have shifted from a disaster recovery to one of disaster risk reduction and management. According to the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, government initiatives now focus more on retrofitting informal housing for increased resiliency and community empowerment to flood mitigation, just to name a few examples. In fact, the 2015-2019 Federal Disaster Management Plan explicitly focuses on risk reduction, increased resiliency, and supporting community-level initiatives. Indonesia is making effort to increase the resiliency of its nation and its people to prepare for a safer future.